I want to say a few things about Daniel Gross's book that we read for this time, and also in the context of the history of emotion. So he pulls together some of the strands of the course that we've been talking about in disparate ways, which is by delineating two traditions in thinking about emotion in from basically from the 17th century to now. And he argues that Descartes is part of a tradition that focuses on the physical and on the body, and that finds its contemporary expression in neuroscience. So, of course, neuroscientists don't believe that all of your emotions are located in the pineal gland. They're definitely a lot more sophisticated than that. But they do have the sense that emotions have a physical cause within the brain, and that's what's being expressed. So in a Cartesian subject, if you the impossible scenario, if you put a baby out in the woods and it raised itself, it would still have the same emotions as anyone else, because it would respond to external stimuli. If a lion roared at it, it would be scared and its heart would beat, and so that line of thinking also suggests a kind of universalism about human beings and about emotion, and that the kind of creature, emotional human in the 17th century isn't really that different from you, because we basically have the same human bodies. I mean, some, tiny evolutionary differences, but mostly we have the same bodies. So Hobbes is actually saying something very different than Descartes in this respect. And so Hobbes is in the tradition of Aristotle, who is thinking about emotions as social. So again, the impossible baby in the woods. If you put a Hobbesian baby in the woods, it would not actually have emotions. It wouldn't have envy, it wouldn't have vainglory. It wouldn't really respond to these things that Hobbes is interested in, because because his argument is that emotions are social and that they're dependent on other people, and very specifically in Hobbes, they're dependent on a kind of social ranks. And so remember, Hobbes talks about how anger only occurs when someone who is below you does something that who you think of as below you does something that offends you. So kings are angry all the time, and peasants are not angry because there isn't anyone below them. So he's laying out these two traditions that I think will be helpful to think about. And there has been a lot of discussion about how Descartes had an influence on the stage. And I think if you go through acting manuals, you'll find a lot of Cartesian influence, where there will be like pictures of what a happy face looks like, what an envious face looks like, what a distressed face looks like, what a very sad face, what an anxious face. So if you look at these acting manuals, they will actually show you what pose to strike that will match an emotion. So that's one kind of influence that Descartes has had. But I think intellectually, for a lot of the playwrights, they're really followers of Hobbes rather than Descartes. And definitely, I think Aphra Behn is a Hobbesian playwright. Actually, I think most of them are Hobbesian. And so if you look at what her sort of ways of creating situations in her plays, they have to do with matching emotions with social understanding, and social rank is a main one, but of course national difference comes into it as well, which are understood to have different emotional contexts, which is of course not something that Descartes would say, because we, again, presuming English people and Spanish people have the same bodies, that would lead to having the same emotional profiles. But one idea that Gross suggests is that in this age, many people have argued that there is a kind of abundance of emotion, that there's a effort to restrain passion, to kind of keep down the levels of emotion. But he argues actually for the opposite. He says his phrase is a scarcity of emotion, which I find really generative in thinking about that. And what that means is that not everybody has the equivalent access, or is assumed to have the equivalent access to the whole range of human emotions. Now, again, just to be clear, this doesn't mean that people really were that way. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, there's some kind of fun ways of finding some things out. Like you actually read a little bit of Pepys's diary. And so when you read Pepys, you can kind of actually see his emotional range and the kinds of things that bother him and what he's concerned about. But he's, one of many people. So we don't really know what the psychological profiles are of all these different people that lived in the 17th century. But we can look at plays where there's a kind of a real interest in the alignment of emotion and social position. And so, for example, in the Rover, I mean, and this is partly why I think disguise is such a big theme in the Restoration, like all over. I mean, this play is kind of extreme in that respect, because half the characters are in disguise for most of the play. But it is something that happens a lot in Restoration plays. And so if you'll notice, what happens in the Rover is the way in which the characters are disguised obscures their social rank. So Helena is an elite young woman, and she dresses up like a gypsy, and it's carnival, so you don't really know who's really a gypsy and who's really an heiress. But she is disguising herself as someone else and experiencing a kind of social relationship that would not be possible in her undisguised self. So you get to see a different side of Wilmore by the way he treats her. And then later, when he knows that she's an heiress, but she doesn't know that he knows that he's an heiress, he's able to manipulate that situation as well by his particular emotional arrangement with her. So some of the characters are able to pick up cues of other characters to discern their rank, and other characters aren't. And so it's very interesting that this is, I think, an important part, especially with the male characters, because it's the females who are in disguise for the play. So Blunt, for example, is the extreme kind of expression of somebody who has, is easily fooled. And so he's fooled specifically on the level of social rank. So Lucetta pretends that she's an elite lady, and he's so excited that this exalted elite lady wants to have sex with him. And really kind of her sexual attraction to him has to do with her perceived status. So he's like really honored that he gets to have sex with this elite woman. And then, of course, he gets dumped in the street in his underwear, because that's not who she really is, but he can't really tell the difference. And so then he vows revenge on the whole sex. So he originally takes Lucetta to be higher than she is, and then he takes Florinda to be lower than she is. Now, in fairness, she's disguised as a lower class person, or you actually don't really know what she's giving off, but she's running around outside, and she's not chaperoned, and so she's kind of up for grabs, in the way that Wilmore takes her to be available, when she's waiting outside of her house for Belleville. And so he so I'm getting a little ahead of myself there, but Blunt is unable to read social cues for either Lucetta or Florinda, and their disguises fool him. And when they first arrive at Carnival, you'll notice that Belleville is able to correctly identify which women are heiresses and which women are prostitutes. And I think, there's a lot of inclination in our modern readers to kind of associate that with sexual virtue, that's the issue. But I think sexual virtue is not really the issue there. The issue is class markers. And so they didn't really need to marry virgins. That's kind of a myth. What they wanted to marry was women with money. And so by making those distinctions, Belleville, of course, falls in love with the woman in the play who has the most money. She's also, his true love, but those things are completely confounded. And so I'm not saying that, his love is fake or anything, but he is a very accurate reader of those social cues, and his feelings follow that correct reading. Whereas Blunt is a terrible reader of social cues, and he gets to experience humiliation. And he also, his final scene where he comes out in Spanish clothes, and also the scene where he's out there running around in his underwear, he is experiences shame because people who he's trying to impress see him in a vulnerable position. And as I talked about before, Blunt is somewhat beneath the other men in kind of his sophistication and his level of honor. And so the other character who has trouble picking up social cues is Wilmore, who is weirdly parallel with Blunt, even though you could say, like, in some ways they're extreme opposites, because Wilmore is like the super cavalier. He's protecting the king. He's really attractive, and all the women do fall for him. But like Blunt, he's not really sharp at telling the differences. So he sees Florinda standing out in front of her house, and he assumes that she is looking for sex. And he doesn't pick up anything else about her except for there's a woman out on the street all by herself. And so he can't really tell the difference. And so he really screws up in that scene. And of course, as Belleville points out, it doesn't matter who she is. You shouldn't treat anyone that way. But clearly, his mistaking her for someone she is not is part of the drama. And of course, he can't really figure out the difference between Helena and Angelica Bianca either. And he sees superficially that Angelica Bianca seems to have a lot of money, but in fact, Helena has way more money, and he does not figure that out. It's dropped by Angelica. And so once he has that information, he can manipulate the situation to his advantage. But these characters are Hobbesian, not in the sense that they're kind of restlessly looking for power in the way, I mean, they are, some of them are, but it's a kind of Hobbesian play in which all their emotions are social, and they're really interested in kind of impressing each other. So it's and so because they're living in this world where status is so deeply connected to their sense of who they are as people, when you put people in disguise, then hilarity ensues because mistakes are made. And then that's when you see the kind of arbitrary absurdity of class difference, but also you kind of see who is able to figure it out and who isn't. Just a couple of more things to say about emotion in this play. So I want to think a little bit more about the character of Angelica Bianca, who I think is really interesting because she's it's almost like there's a little tragedy embedded in the larger comedy because of what happens to her and her fate. So we don't really know a lot about her backstory, but we can assume because she's Paduan, she's native Italian, she's kind of a colonized subject, if you will, of the invading Spanish force, that she she was raised to a position that was not her original class status. So that's part of what is happening with Angelica Bianca, is that she's raised to this very high status because she was the lover of the general, but she may have been from a humbler background herself. And so she's kind of resented by some of the other male characters because, if you remember, especially by Wilmore, because she's asking too much money. So she's being accused of vainglory by him, of overpricing herself, of thinking of herself as more valuable than she actually is. And so she actually does have money and she takes care of him, and she has this naive idea that she and Wilmore can put aside their social trappings and all of their history and their status and just simply be lovers in a way that doesn't involve status or an exchange of money. And of course she does end up giving him money, so it's not the case that that's actually happening, but somehow she is able to think of herself as a romantic heroine, or a heroine of romance, I should say, not really romantic in the modern sense, but as a kind of elite figure, when in fact I think Wilmore's point is that she does not deserve that status. So there's something very poignant about what happens to her. And so she's interesting because she has only been treated in this exalted way for many, many years because she was the mistress of a very important person, and might be sort of thought of as like the mistresses of the king in England, who had very powerful places at court and would be used to being treated with great respect and even obsequiousness, because there was a lot that they could do for somebody if they wanted to, but politically and for their career. But in this exchange with Wilmore, she kind of misreads her position and thinks of herself that because she's achieved this wealth and this status, that of course is temporary, because she needs to find a new lover to take care of her, because she doesn't have any renewing sense of renewing income, that she kind of misreads her position, and so she has emotions appropriate to somebody in a different position. And so it's kind of it's sad, and he ends up going with the woman who can bring him more of an income, and Angelica ends up getting exploited by him, which you could read in one of two ways. You could read it that she was vainglorious and she has to be taken down, and but since it's Afro Ben, I think the other way to read it is that the play exposes some of the injustice of the situation and exposes her vulnerability. And I think it, by going in disguise, the elite women in the play also get to experience men in their circle who address them in ways that would not be available to them if they were still dressed as their appearing as their elite selves. And so they kind of there is a view of how those lower in status end up being treated in this play, and also a kind of sense of her vulnerability and her dignity and her emotional capacity, even if it's not appropriate to her rank. It is certainly revealed to be possible.